All right, so this is about chapter 17.2 in your textbooks. Natural selection, how it changes the populations, or how evolution changes genetic populations. First of all, we're going to talk about how natural selection affects those single gene traits, those traits that are simple, determined by one gene. Natural selection acting on one gene, single gene traits, can change allele frequencies. So that 20% or that 40%, 60%, big B, little b, it can change it from 50-50 or to 60-40. It can change that frequency of an allele. We see this express, this change, in the actual phenotypes. The phenotypes will change if that allele frequency changes. So with the grasshopper examples, the allele frequency of green grasshopper was higher to begin with, and the yellow was lower, but over time, the yellow became higher and the green lower. So that allele frequency changed, and you could actually physically see that in the phenotype of the organisms. The grasshoppers was an example. Also in your book, in chapter 17.2, it talks about lizards and their color. And it talks about a population of lizards. The initial population, if you can see, I don't know, right here, the initial population mostly brown, a few red lizards and a few black lizards. Then over time, evolution picked for certain traits or phenotypes over others. And after 30 generations, there was no more red lizard, and there was 40% brown and 60% black. So actually, the number of brown lizards went down, and the number of black lizards went up, and the red lizards went kaput, went bye-bye. So natural selection, picking for single gene traits, those controlled by one gene, it actually changes the allele frequencies, and you can actually see the change in the phenotypes of those organisms. Natural selection can also happen on more complex traits, those polygenic traits like height that we talked about, that produces a bell curve. And how it acts on these traits, it impacts the fitness. Oops, say fitness. And remember, we're not talking about physical fitness here. We're talking about how well an organism can survive and reproduce in the environment. So it changes the fitness of the phenotypes. And we'll talk about the three different types of selection, or the resulting of the natural selection that we see with polygenic, it should say. Polygenic, not polygenous traits. So the three types are directional selection, stabilizing, and disruptive. So we're going to see that bell curve change in these three different ways because of natural selection. You'll need to be able to explain those graphs and recognize what's happening. The first one is called directional selection. The original distribution of whatever it is, you can see, in this case it's, we're talking about birds and beak size, is in the dashed line, and the the new distribution is in the solid line. So it shows kind of what happened over time. Natural selection is favoring birds with larger beaks, so we can see the actual bell curve shift to the right. It moves a direction. Either it will favor the larger phenotype, and thus moving it to the right. We can draw an arrow. Okay, it actually, you can see it's physically moving it to the right. Or it could favor the smaller phenotype, and in that case, the arrow would move, that bell curve would move to the left. So right down here, right, it favors the larger or smaller phenotype. In this example, it is a larger phenotype. And your book talks about an example how that could happen. Imagine the birds in their population, the only food source is seeds with large, thick shells, and not many of the small seeds. So birds that had larger beaks could open up those seeds easier to consume them, and thus they survive easier. And the birds that don't have the large beaks die. And so that over time, that trait would kind of disappear in that population. The next type of selection is called stabilizing selection. Again, we see the graph of the original bell curve and the original distribution, and then we see the new graph that's produced. You can actually see the graph is squeezing inward, and that middle group is rising taller. So this type of selection favors the intermediate phenotype, the phenotype in the middle. Not too big, not too small, the phenotype in the middle. And the example your book talks about is about birth mass or birth weight. When turn the lights on. When humans are born, we're talking about humans here, their weight when they're born. And this is the percentage of the population. So you can see that right here, babies that are too big are not favored. And babies that are too small are not favored, evolutionarily speaking. Because if you think about it, babies that get too big, they have a hard time getting out, literally, of their moms. Thus, now we have C-sections that helps with that. But that would favor intermediate phenotype. Also, doctors now will not let a child get to be that big, because then they worry about a few things, the mother being able to get the baby out, and also the amniotic fluid that's in the womb, that possibly running out. So most of the physicians nowadays, or anyone, will make sure the baby doesn't get too big inside of her if she's getting, if she goes past her due date, for example. And they'll even maybe set an induction date to induce labor so the baby doesn't get too big, because the baby could die if it doesn't have enough amniotic fluid, or the mother will have a hard time getting the baby out. The smaller babies, this makes more sense probably to you, they have a less likely chance of surviving because they're so small, their lungs aren't fully developed, and they have a hard time surviving. The chances of them making it aren't very high when they're born premature. So selection in this case favors the intermediate phenotype for birth mass. The third type of selection for polygenic traits is called disruptive. Here we can see the shape of the original graph and then the new graph in the solid line. And this graph is doing some crazy things, okay? We can see it getting bigger on the top end and the bottom end. So selection favors actually the large and the small phenotypes, not the intermediate. So it creates that M-shaped graph. In the example your book talks about is beak size again with birds and a number in a population. And essentially, let's say we're talking about the same birds and their beak size, and birds with large beaks have their big seeds, and birds with small beaks have their little seeds, but there's no intermediate seeds available in the environment in size. So the birds with beaks that are medium size aren't favored because their beak is not the appropriate size. So we can see the shape of that population showing the disruptive selection shape. Okay, now we're going to talk about something called genetic equilibrium. When I say equal, or the equal part of the word, it should make you think of things being fair, things not changing, kind of like homeostasis, a steady state. Genetic equilibrium, if a population or whatever it is, lizards, humans, insects, is in genetic equilibrium, that essentially means that that population is not evolving. It's not changing, okay? Not changing at all in any way. It's in genetic equilibrium. If the population is not evolving, that means the allele frequency, it's the numbers of letters, aren't changing. Do not change. Those percentages aren't changing at all. The population is said to be in genetic equilibrium. This is an equation called the Hardy-Weinberg principle, and it's an equation used to calculate allele frequency in a population. So p squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1, and p plus q equals 1. And I showed you with the arrows what those letters represent and how you can actually determine allele frequency and calculate that. We will not actually do that, but I just wanted to show you how it can be calculated. At this time, I want you to notice that after you're done with the notes here, you're going to have to go online. I put a link for a TED Ed. It's called, The 5 Fingers of Evolution. Okay, 5 Fingers of Evolution. So after this page, these notes, you will need to go watch that and then complete the think questions. And they're related to these 5 things. Now, a population that is not evolving, that's in genetic equilibrium, isn't likely because there are these 5 things that can mess up that genetic equilibrium, that can cause it to evolve. And those 5 things are non-random mating. Why does that? Non-random mating. Okay, that's saying if somebody else controlled who you're going to mate with. Okay, for humans it'd be like parents telling you who you're going to have children with. Okay, that would mess up genetic equilibrium. Another thing that can mess up that equilibrium is a small population size. Right in here, genetic drift. A small population size, if you have big swings in people coming in or people going out, that can change the population, cause it to evolve relatively quickly and easily. Or if genes moved or organisms moved. Okay, so small population size. If somebody dies and they carry lots of the genetics for that community, they're going to change that community, that allele frequency dramatically. Or if somebody's born, same kind of thing. Larger populations don't have to worry too much about that genetic drift or genes coming in or leaving, as it happens all the time. Another thing that can mess up genetic equilibrium, and I kind of reference it related to the small population size, is immigration and emigration. You have a population and suddenly you get hundreds of immigrants to that community. Is that going to change the number of alleles in that community? You bet. We have a small community in Thief River Falls and we get a whole bunch of people from China that come live here. They're going to bring different alleles for skin color than we have. And so that's going to change the genetic equilibrium, going to change the allele frequency. And emigration is just when people leave. And they could take those alleles, those genes with them. And that will cause the population to evolve, and thus changing the genetic equilibrium. The fourth thing here, mutations. I hinted at it. If population organisms are mutating, that's going to mess up genetic equilibrium, cause evolution. And the fifth thing is natural selection. Nature picking what it wants. Can't really control for that. And that is going to mess up genetic equilibrium.